Okay, the next thing we're going to do here in Module 2 is look at the form of arguments. As we've seen by now, logic is focused primarily on the structure or the form of the arguments, and special emphasis is going to be placed on the evaluation of the connections between the steps of the argument, namely the inferences. So important part of critical thinking is developing the ability to evaluate inferences. This is the Stockintrade of Logic. So the key then to evaluating whether the argument as a whole is formally correct involves trying to determine whether the conclusion follows logically from the basic assumptions of the argument. So this core idea then of following logically from will give this a great deal of consideration going forward. This is also known as as logical consequence. So following logically from, this concept will come into focus as we go forward. But the point, at least, is to understand whether a conclusion follows from the premises, whether it's a genuine logical consequence of the premises. We'll see more about that going forward. So we've got to begin with common sense always, and most of us are going to have the ability to recognize obvious failures in reasoning, so obvious contradictions or obvious non sequiturs. A non sequitur just means something that doesn't follow, an unjustified jump in a train of thought, or obvious violations of basic norms of inquiry. So for example, if I'm attacking the person and not her argument, if I'm threatening people with force, etc., etc. These are obvious violations of the norms of collective inquiry, of common truth-seeking projects. So the study of logic anyway is designed to help us supplement this basic common sense capacity to recognize clear errors in the case of more difficult examples. So one sort of slightly contentious point that I would endorse is that we derive our basic logical norms and our capacities from a common sense ability to recognize when arguments go wrong. Not all philosophers would accept that. So consider how easily, anyway, we can recognize obvious contradictions in an argument. So we can recognize, for example, if someone says, it's true that I haven't paid the taxes I owe for 10 years, but I swear I'm a law-abiding citizen. Now he would, in this case, be clearly contradicting himself, and that would be an obvious contradiction. If someone says, because Socrates was ugly, he was a good philosopher, there might be some elaborate joke there or some deeper point, but at least on the surface it looks like an obvious non sequitur. His being ugly probably had nothing to do with him being a good philosopher. If someone says, for example, I wouldn't trust her to watch my purse, she's Hungarian, clearly they're exhibiting a bias of some sort that, at least as it's presented here, has no support. Finally, an example of what's called the slippery slope fallacy. If we encountered the following claim, someone might say, if we allow same-sex couples to marry, then why not allow people to marry household appliances? I think it's pretty obvious why that's a bad piece of reasoning, and that's an example of what we'll learn about later, the so-called slippery slope fallacy. So slippery slopes, contrary to what you might generally think are fallacious, are flawed patterns of reasoning. We'll learn more about that later. So we're concerned then to understand how sentences follow from or are implied by other sentences. And sometimes we'll talk about a sentence being a logical consequence of some premises, etc. We'll learn more about that going forward. One important aspect of logically correct patterns of reasoning is their truth-preserving nature. So by calling something truth-preserving, we mean that if we start out with some set of true sentences and we follow the rules of good reasoning, then we'll never be led to affirm a false sentence. So reasoning in a logically correct manner won't lead us astray. So here are some examples of good pieces of reasoning. So if I say Jen and Jan are mammals, this implies that Jen is a mammal. I can conclude that Jen is a mammal, and that is because it's a valid or a good pattern of reasoning. We'll see more about this going forward. Roger is chordate, or Data is fleshy, and Data is not fleshy implies Roger's chordate. We'll have a look at this in the next couple of slides. This is an inference called disjunctive syllogism. All dogs are mammals implies that some dogs are mammals. Finally, Marie is in Texas implies that Marie is in Texas, or she's in Jupiter, or in this case Marie is in Texas, or Jupiter is inhabited by lopers, or Bill Clinton is a Martian, etc., etc. So we can you'll see why that's contrary to appearance. This is actually a valid inference. So the inference from Marie is in Texas to Marie is in Texas, or Jupiter is inhabited by lopers. Okay, so we're also concerned with deductive inference. So the deductive inference is, again, familiar pattern, beginning with premises and moving to a conclusion. It's the move, again, is the inference, and we're going to be studying which of these inferences or which patterns are good ones and which ones are bad ones. So if it were true, for example, so here's the inference. This is a good piece of reasoning. It uses exotic or unusual premises, but the points are clear. So if it were true, how does the reasoning go? Well, if it were true that if Harry's in El Paso, then Harry will have a lizard skin wallet, and if it were true that Harry does not have a lizard skin wallet, then you'd know that Harry's not in El Paso is true. So I've broken it up here so you can see how the chain of reasoning might take place. So what have we got here? Well, this is going to be an example of what's called modus tollens, of another valid pattern, where the denial of the consequent implies the falsity of the antecedent. We'll talk more about that too. Point for now is just to focus on form. So here's an informal case. So here let's have a look at this example. I know that Xochitl really likes Joy Division because she either likes to listen to them or she's pretending to like them so that she can impress her pretentious friends. And I know that she's not trying to impress her pretentious friends. So notice here the conclusion appeared right at the beginning. This was her thesis statement, or her main contention, or our main contention. I know that Xochitl likes Joy Division. And then the question is, how do you know that? Well, we've got some premises. First, she either likes to listen to them or she's pretending. I know she's not pretending, therefore she likes to listen to them. Now, that's a very simple argument, and we could of course worry about the validity, we couldn't worry about the validity of the argument. The argument's perfectly valid, but we could worry about the truth of the premises. So let's see how this works. So the premises of this little argument are two sentences. Xochitl either likes Joy Division or she's trying to impress her pretentious friends. And, second premise, she's not trying to impress her pretentious friends. So from these two, the conclusion is that Xochitl likes Joy Division. But how did her reasoning move from the premises to the conclusion? So how come we feel like this, just using common sense, that this is a legitimate move? Well, again, barring our concerns about the premises. So this is a legitimate pattern of inference known as deductive syllogism. And we're going to see lots of cases like this, like deductive syllogism. Many legitimate patterns of inference will come up in later chapters. But intuitively, I hope you can already see how it works. So if you know that either A or B is true, and you know that B is false, then you can conclude validly that A is true. Alternatively, if you know that A or B is true, and you know that A is false, then you can conclude that B is true. And this is the rule that we call disjunctive syllogism, or DS, or pattern that we call DS, or disjunctive syllogism. And here it is presented formally. So, of course, lots more to say about this. This is a first taste of things to come.